We are going to begin with Anna Jane Moyer, and it is my pleasure to introduce her. And I should preface all this by saying that at least 3 of our speakers, probably most of you don't need an introduction for, but I'm just going to say a few words and just to make them feel welcome as they come up here, and also for some of our younger audiences who might not know all of our speakers. So, if you attended Gettysburg College between 1961 and 1999, I'm not sure how you could not know Anna Jane, our librarian emerita and local historian of Gettysburg College. Excuse me. For nearly 40 years, as you all know, Anna Jane helped the Gettysburg College community to do their jobs. Through her research expertise, she helped professors and students to plunge into worlds of knowledge that they probably couldn't have imagined without her. Today, Anna Jane will speak about the early history of Gettysburg College. So please join me in welcoming Anna Jane.
Thank you, Allison. Greetings, everyone. It's a great year, 2010, to celebrate women at Gettysburg College. On the 4th of April is the anniversary of the decision of the Board of Trustees to have women enter in a full-fledged, permanent kind of way, which changed the complexion of the college and made it as you see it now. 2010 is also the year of the 125th anniversary of the Board of Trustees allowing women to enter the college to study. And I'll try to clarify those two as I move along. How did women happen to come to Gettysburg? From its early years, the college had what was called the preparatory department. It prepared students not only to enter Gettysburg, but other colleges. And the decision was made considering the fact that there were women who were relatives of the faculty, women from town who wanted to get an education. The decision was made to open that preparatory school to women of the town and the community in 1883. 9 women entered, and they did very well. And then the question arose, well, what if one of these young ladies wants to go to the college? What will we do? And so, after 3 motions, each in turn being defeated, until the final motion, it was decided that the college could open its doors to let women study there. The first woman to walk through that door of opportunity was named Beulah Tipton, and she came in 1888. She was the daughter of W.H. Tipton, the well-known Gettysburg photographer, and she lived with her family on Chambersburg Street. Beulah stayed only for 1.5 years, however, because of illness, and never re-entered. And so the woman who bears the title of the first woman to graduate from Gettysburg College is Cora Hartman in the class of 1894. Cora entered as one woman among 60 freshmen in her class. I should say that Beulah was one woman among 185 men in the total college. She lived at a boarding house on Chambersburg Street, that is Cora, and during the weekend, her father would come with a horse and buggy to take her home. And if it were a nice day like today and he was busy with farm work, she might ride the horse herself and keep it in the stable of the boarding house, or she might walk the 5 miles from Lewisburg into the college. Her prior education had been in prep, and before that she went to a 1-room schoolhouse in Lewisburg. And it was extraordinarily rare and unusual that a woman of that background at that time would gain a college degree. She had a classmate named Margaret Himes, who followed her in alphabetical order and therefore didn't get the initial title. Margaret was from a privileged family. Her father was a professor of English language and literature at the college. Her grandfather was a professor at the seminary. His name was Dr. Charles Augustus Hay, and he was the person who pushed and pushed and pushed to allow women to study at Gettysburg. And of course, he had some granddaughters in mind. Margaret lived with her family in the seminary area with her grandparents until they moved to Carlisle Street, so that's where she was as a college student. Now, these women were not intended to participate in the total life of the college. They were considered day students. That's what Cora Hartman called them. That's what the faculty called them. We might think of them as special students. There were no dormitories or any dining facilities for women. These women formed among themselves their own organizations or activities. They claimed their own space. It was called the cigar box because of its size. It was big enough to hold books and coats and bag lunches. And it was a small room near the stairs in the lobby of Gladfelder Hall. Now, just to give you an idea of how things were, these women decided that they would like to attend required morning chapel. And so they had to petition the faculty to be able to do that. And you can hear the boys saying, oh, only girls would think of that. Well, anyway, they got their wish, and they were allowed to sit in the unused balcony in Brewitt Chapel. Of course, they had to clean it first because there was only sort of like a one-man plus maintenance department at that time. Things were going well. The college enrollment flourished. There were 622 students in 1929, and the board decided, you know, we don't really have facilities or accommodation for women. We just need to close that off. And so they decided there would be no more women accepted after 1929. Those who were here would graduate in 1933, and 9 of them did that. However, they had not counted on the stock market crashing in October of 1929. So enrollment dropped severely, prep was not doing well, and finally, in 1935, the decision was made that they really needed to close prep, to take the facilities that prep used in Huber and Stevens and renovate them and commit them to women. And so that is how the motion passed, that women would become full-fledged, permanent, regular parts of the college community. 55 women entered that first September of '35. Was the college coeducational then? Well, everything you read and everything you feel a part of at that time, you get the decided feeling that it was really still a men's college with a women's division. In fact, that's what the area was called, the Women's Division, or the WD for short. The person who headed that division was the former headmaster of prep, which had been known as the Gettysburg Academy. When he retired, a dean of women was appointed in 1941. And as I think of your reflections this morning, I can simply say that it took time and the winds of change until we became a coeducational learning community.
Thank you very much, Anna Jane, for starting us off with that. Next, please help me to welcome Nancy Locker, who I think we all will agree was one of those winds of change that Anna Jane just referenced. As you can see from her bio, and once again, please refer to the yellow sheets that you got when you came in. As you can see from her biography, Nancy came to Gettysburg College in 1962, just 1 year after Jane, and held a number of important roles over the next 27 years. She began as a lecturer in psychology and a counseling psychologist, and in 1968 became Dean of Women. And many of you were here when she was the Dean of Women, and I heard people talking to her in the restroom about this, and the kind of the fear she inspired. And in this role, and hopefully Nancy will be able to speak a little bit more about this, because I heard quite a bit about this in this morning sessions. In this role, she worked to give Gettysburg College women students the independence and freedom they certainly deserved. And she helped to get rid of the curfew hours in the residence halls and things of that nature. Nancy chaired the all-important Title IX Self-Study Committee in the 1970s, and then some years later retired as Dean of Student Advisement in 1989. And as a Director of Parent Relations, I can't help but be impressed by Nancy's avant-garde approach to higher education, which is illustrated by her publication, College, A Complete Guide for Parents and Students. I can tell you that in 2010, this is the kind of reading that today's college parents still crave. And so it's quite remarkable that she was thinking of college parents at a time when a lot of colleges and universities were not really considering parents as part of their community. Today, Nancy will speak about her work with Title IX at Gettysburg College. So please help me to welcome Nancy Locker to America.
Thank you, Allison. At least I'm not the dean who was here in 1941. I may be ancient, but... Well, one of the most significant things in regard to equality, parity for women happened in the 1970s, and that was the enactment of Title IX. Now, when we think of Title IX, we most often think of athletics. And obviously, that's where the most egregious sins took place. But Title IX went far beyond athletics. It really pertained to any sexual discrimination that might exist in any of the programs or activities on a college or university campus. Now, in 1975, President Arnold Hanson appointed the Title IX Self-Study Committee, and he named me chair. But the other members of the committee, and there were 4 others, were my partner in crime over here, Margaret Stewart, and then there were 3 men. Ron Couchman, who was the registrar, Bob Nordval, who was the assistant dean of the college at that time, and Richard Westcott, who taught in the Health and Physical Education Department, as it was known then. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that for Title IX Self-Study Committee, the women were still outnumbered. But I must say that the men who did serve on that committee were open-minded and fair, and they worked very cooperatively with us. And we met for weekly for 1 academic year. So we tried to be as thorough as we could in looking at all aspects of Gettysburg College to see if we were in compliance. Now, at the end of that period, we wrote a pretty hefty report, but in the meantime, we would send certain memoranda to the president and things that we found that we thought needed to be taken care of. Now, in the time that I have, I'm going to try to hit just some of the high spots because that's all I can do in 6 to 8 minutes. And I'm going to talk mostly about things that you may not have thought of that we looked into besides athletics. I'll touch on athletics too. One of the first things we looked at was the classroom situation. Did women have equal access to classes? Were they treated any differently? What about majors? Were they counseled into going into just the majors that were expected for women students, or were they encouraged to look at other student possibilities in the sciences and math and so on? Now, we didn't find anything very significant in those areas that were out of place, but we did put in a grievance procedure so that if they should turn up in the future, there would be ways in which they could be properly dealt with. Now, another thing we looked at were the prizes and awards that were given annually to students. And there we did find some things that were not right. There were some prizes that were in men's, for male students only, and there was nothing equivalent for women. So we said to the president, you know, the college has got to go back to the original donor or his or her legal representative and get the wording changed, or else set up an equivalent kind of prize for women. Now, and that was done. Still another area that we investigated was the housing situation and all facilities. And we were a peripatetic committee. We visited the sites. We poked our noses in the locker rooms, and we peered into the bathrooms and the residence halls, and we looked all over. And what we found as far as the housing was concerned was that at that time the women tended to live in the older houses, residence halls, while the men had the newer ones. But actually the women's houses were a little bit better. You know? They were better furnished, they had study rooms, the bathrooms had both showers and bathtubs, and we didn't notice this in particular. We kind of bent over backwards, you know, to be even-handed so that the men wouldn't think that we were just, you know, only looking out for the women. We found that there was only one male residence hall that had a bathtub, and that was Patrick Hall. Terrible. So we also found that in the men's locker rooms, there were fewer hair dryers than there were in the women's. We sort of understand that, but nonetheless, we wrote a memorandum to the president pointing out these things, and we said there should be more study halls in the men's residence halls and so on, because we could foresee in the future that things might change, and women might be living in those halls, and vice versa. And we got a memorandum back from the president, in tongue-in-cheek, I might add, saying that he had taken note of our memorandum, and that, yes, there were more urinals in the men's. He would see that that was rectified right away. And furthermore, he would speak to the chair of the biology department and ask him to put plants in those urinals so that they would be appropriately decorated. Well, moving right along, we looked too at student employment. And there we found that there were certain jobs that were designated for men only. And we asked, well, why is that? Well, they involve heavy lifting. And I said, hey, we've got some pretty tough, strong women students on this campus. This can't be. You have to judge the job by the individual, not by the gender. So those things changed. Now, what about athletics? Let me see, where's Timmy? Whoops, Helen. She's here somewhere. She knows all about this. Certainly, as far as athletics are concerned, there were some gross differences. The women, well, let me say the men all had the use of Brain Gym, which was a new building at that time. Their facilities were really, really very, very nice. The women were relegated to plank. Plank had a leaky roof. It had a floor that had been used for so many years and was so thin that nails even stuck up. That had to change. These are expensive, of course, renovations. But fortunately, the president made allowances in his budget for that, and those things were changed. We found that the men's athletic teams all had full uniforms and full practice uniforms, including shoes and socks. Fortunately for Timmy, they had shoes. The women had nothing. They were sewing their own uniforms at that time. The men had full laundry service. The women had nothing. So those are some gross inequities. There were 2 universal gyms on the campus in those days. They were both in Brain Gym. Now, one was in a place where women could get to, and they had access to. The other was in the men's locker room. It made it a little tricky. We had to look also at the number and kinds of teams that were available. And we suggested that that volleyball be added as a sport for women to kind of help equalize the number and the demand. And those teams that, for which there was no women's team that was a non-contact sport, women had to be allowed to try out for things like golf, rifle team, and so on. So there were just many, many inequities there as far as locker room experience. I think Timmy mentioned that Grace Kenny's office was the size of a cigar box, but the locker room for women was downright shabby, where those for men were really very good. So there were many, many things that we wrote about in our final report. And the gratifying thing is that changes were made in those days with the help of a cooperative administration, but Title IX was the impetus for that, getting things moving. And I think as we see how things are today, we can be very grateful for Title IX and for the evolution and change that has come about since then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Next, I'd like to introduce Mary Margaret Stewart. And just as with Anna Jane and with Nancy, there is nary an alumna who attended Gettysburg College, and dare I say alumnus as well, between 1959 and 1996, who doesn't know Mary Margaret Stewart, Professor Emerita, and all that she did in her 37-year career here for women, for the English department, for all of her students, and for the college in general. A few highlights from her, I'm just going to share a few highlights from her biography, just because I think they're worth reading out loud, and I quote, "Throughout her career at Gettysburg College, women's issues remained a central concern. The representation and equality of women in the student body, faculty, and administration, the use of gender-free language, the introduction of women's studies. She offered the first women's studies course in the early 1970s, Woman as Literary Artist, and team taught with Nancy Locker, Women and Madness, in January terms 1975 and 1976. She served on the Title IX Self-Study Committee in 1975-76, as we just heard, and on the first Women's Commission in 1985 to 1988. And today, Mary Margaret will tell us about the early classes she taught in women's studies. Please join me in welcoming Mary Margaret.
Thank you, Allison. Actually, I'm not going to say very much about the women's studies courses I taught. Alice can talk about that later.
That's what I was told you wrote.
I know. What I've decided to talk about are 70s memories. Excitement, discovery, frustration, and progress. For me, the 70s began the last few days of December 1969 at the famous or infamous, depending on your political stance, annual meeting of the Modern Language Association in New York City. A meeting which had profound effect on the way annual meetings were organized, not only at MLA, but in all professional organizations from then on. It had profound effect on the curriculum of modern languages in all institutions, and also on the importance of classroom teaching, and not least on women in the profession. Radicals usurped the meeting, and some, those who took a militant stand against the Vietnam War, were arrested by the New York City police. They made the headlines, but they organized more important and profound actions. Teach-ins, discussion groups, meetings to come up with strategies on how to change the organization. I attended a meeting in those interested in the place of women in the organization and profession. And when Florence Howe, who had called the meeting, asked for a volunteer to chair a small committee to write and then present a motion to create a women's commission in MLA, I volunteered. That's what happens to preachers' kids. They always volunteer. And at our small group, of which some of you remember Sherry Flynn, who was a young instructor here, late 60s, early 70s. She was at the meeting too, and she served on the small committee. We wrote a resolution which was adopted. I stood in line behind a microphone at the business meeting on Sunday, a meeting usually one that no member attended, but this one was standing room only. And the motion was accepted, seconded, and passed overwhelmingly. MLA's action became a signal for other professional organizations to address the concerns of women in their associations. For instance, the American Association of University Professors formed a Committee W and suggested that each chapter do the same. Gettysburg College, which at that time had an active AAUP chapter, appointed Amy Tannenbaum, Roger Stamen, and me to such a committee. Our main task was to survey the faculty on attitudes towards women, students, faculty, administration, on curriculum, and other such matters. And we used as our survey instrument one developed by the American Historical Society. As I remember, we found the results depressing and discouraging, but it did serve great importance in starting discussions and in raising consciousness, which was, of course, an important term in the 70s. There was also, one of my memories is, of course, the passage of 1972, Title IX, and it was exciting and rigorous to serve on Nancy Locker's committee. I can't imagine what she must have been like, Stina Wing. We had lively discussions in the faculty meeting on the use of gender-free language and trying to explain why such language was important. Enough of this generic he, some of us offer. We are also she's and hers. My most vivid memory is standing in faculty meeting shouting at Alex Rowland that he was a sexist. Now you have to remember that Alex Rowland was one of the faculty members, one of my colleagues that I liked best, and one of them that I admired the most, and that's probably why he angered me. In the early 70s, courses which began to focus on women began to appear in the curriculum. And I believe my Women in, as Literary Artists was the first such course, which I offered, I think, in a spring term rather than a January term. About the same time, Carrie Moore offered a course in Women in the Religion Department, and that was an important step forward too, and soon other courses appeared. Such courses in literature showed students, both men and women, that women not only read and study literature, but they also write works of significance. These courses also challenged the canon, what we call the literary canon, the prescribed works a major studied in the study of literature and language. Works selected and written almost entirely by white males. And so the introduction of such courses were an important, I think, impetus in changing not only the curriculum at Gettysburg College, but in helping to form, I hope it's not a new canon, but a new set of principles for the study of literature. Some of the women this morning mentioned January term, and in the history of Gettysburg College, and particularly in development of teaching methods and courses, I think the January term is extremely important and significant because it gave us a time in which we could experiment with ways of teaching and teaching with other professors and introducing subject matter that our colleagues might not think was appropriate for this fall term or the spring term, but just for a month in January, that'd be all right. And eventually they crept into the fall and spring terms as well. One of the most important, I think, developments was in interdisciplinary study. And I ventured, for the first and only time in my experience, to be a team teacher. I was very careful. I selected Nancy Locker. When Nancy agreed that she would help me develop a course that we called Women in Madness. Now you realize I represented the women and Nancy and we did another thing too that was different. We met in the conference room in the Dean of Students quadrant of offices to show to students and other faculties that learning and fair discussions could actually take place in the administration building. In the 1970s, there were more women on the faculty than there were when I came in 1959, but there still were very few women on the faculty. So one of the things that faculty members, both men and women, sought to do in the 70s was increase the number of women in teaching positions, on tenure track, and in the administration as well. And another thing that we tried very hard to do was to permanently change the ratio of 60-40 to equal representation of men and women and admittance to Gettysburg College, not by gender, but by intellectual power and by motivation. At the same time, there were works by women and about women being published, theoretical works in literature, sociology, psychology, which made the study of women really exciting in the 70s when you think it didn't have such works much earlier. Editions of works by women were published, good ones, and textbooks for courses on women were published for the first time. And in, I think it was 1974, but it was around in there, Phi Beta Kappa invited to campus as their visiting scholar Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was then a member of the faculty at Columbia School of Law and serving as a lead attorney in sex discrimination courses. And Jan Powers was looking for classes where she could attend. And since I was teaching women as literary artists, I said, she's welcome to come to my class, even though she won't talk about literature. But we talked about women in the law primarily, and about her cases in discrimination. I wanted to tell you this because I think you all wonder why she got appointed to the Supreme Court. And it's because she visited a Gettysburg. She was very, very exciting to be around. As quiet and calm and little, she's really little as she is, and I'm still extremely flattered that she came to visit us. At the same time, we had so few women on the faculty, there really weren't many women to talk to about the changes that were taking place and the new works that were coming out. So Bev Eddy, who was director of the Central Pennsylvania Consortium at the time, organized a small group of women from F&M, Dickinson, Gettysburg, I can't remember whether Wilson was a contributor to this or not, to gather for potluck dinners once a month to discuss works that were being published and projects of our own that concerned women. And these were inspirational and made you feel that you were a part of a growing community. The 70s for me culminated in a CPC conference held at Gettysburg campus, held on Gettysburg College campus, on a topic that we at Gettysburg suggested, and that was women in academia. There was a tremendous response to the conference. It was crowded by both faculty, administrators, and also by students, all of whom took part in the program. So what we started in the 70s, we were excited about what was going on. We were often frustrated and angry at what was going or not going on, but it certainly served the way for the great changes that took place in the 80s and continued to make now in the 90s and in the first decade of the millennium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Margaret. Before I introduce our final speaker, I just want to personally thank everyone for committing today to participating in this conference and joining us. And as I said earlier, it was really a pleasure to serve on the planning committee, and I just want to thank you personally, if I don't get a chance to do that before the day ends, for coming and being with us today. The final person who will be speaking, I think, for lunch is Stephanie Sellers, and I think it's important to note that she is the first permanent director of the Women's Center, which for the past 20 years was an annually rotating advisory position held by various college administrators and faculty. She is a Pennsylvania State Certified Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Volunteer Counselor, and teaches topics in Native American Studies in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and English departments. Stephanie is on the National Women's Studies Association Speakers Bureau and is currently guest editor of the feminist journal FemSpec, honoring Paula Gunn Allen. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie Sellers, who has a few important awards to give this afternoon.
Not damaging the awards has been a primary concern since this morning. They have arrived safely. Good afternoon, everyone. As I'm listening to the remembrances this morning, I'm also thinking about that I was born in Gettysburg. I was born here in the 60s to the first woman physician in the area, Dr. Maitland. Remember Dr. Maitland? I remember fondly being taken to her office, which was in her home, and sitting on the examination table next to her cats. It broke the tension. And my great uncle is graduated from Gettysburg College in the 1940s, Albert Bear. And then he took over my great grandfather's little bank down the road. And he still speaks fondly of getting an education, such a fine education, so close to home. I'm going out, so. The Woman of Distinction Award is what I'm here to present. It has been presented by the Women's Center annually since the 1980s to an alum of Gettysburg College who has distinguished herself as a leader in her chosen career and her community. Previous recipients of the award include Janet Morgan Riggs and Ruth Crowley Fortenbaugh. This year, the Women's Center is broadening the criteria for the award to include an outstanding woman member of our college community. And there will also be 2 awards, or 2 women honored this year. The first is, drum roll please, Anna Jane Moyer. Anna Jane Moyer, as you've heard and have in your biographical information in front of you, which I will offer some highlights. She, of course, served as a reference instruction librarian here at the college from 1961 to 1999. Through using the college archives, she became intensely interested in the history of Gettysburg College and wrote about it for the Alumni magazine. Her introduction to the college was accompanied by the unique experience of living with its first woman graduate. Anna Jane is the author of To Awaken Fond Memory, Moments in the History of Gettysburg College. And let's give her. College, please accept this award in honor of your service.
Thank you. It means so much to me, and I deeply thank you. And I must say, I'm shocked. I must also say that I got my library degree at Drexel University, and I bought a Seiko clock. With a Drexel commemoration on it. And it has lost just recently anything that turns the hands. And so I have minus a clock.
The second Woman of Distinction Award will go to Susan K. Garrison. Just some highlights from her bio. Last night she was with me at the Women's Center and I had to be careful I didn't say anything. Just some highlights from her bio. I want to point out that she advocates for women through her leadership on the National Association of Commissions for Women, the Pennsylvania Commission for Women, the EEWC Christian Feminism Today, Friends of the Delaware County Women's Commission, and Pennsylvania NARAL. She is the author of the Center Foundation's Mentor Training Handbook with Dr. Anita Rogers, and Women's Commissions and Their Friends with Dr. Janet Rosenberg. I also want to say or announce that the mystery donor that Tema Berg was referring to this morning is indeed Susan K. Garrison, and she has created the Susan K. Garrison 1974 Women's Studies Program Fund, so we thank her for that.
Since I've already spoken today, I just want to say that I think that having a clock is really great because it'll always remind me of the wonderful time that I spent here at Gettysburg.